We're talking my favorite subject, American history, specifically the history of race and incarceration. We're going to get into it. Let's get it. Welcome. First of all, welcome. This is Unsolicited Perspectives. I'm your host, Bruce Anthony, here to lead the conversation in important events and topics that are shaping today's society. Join the conversation and follow us wherever you get your audio podcasts. Subscribe to our YouTube channel for our video podcast, YouTube exclusive content, and our YouTube membership. Rate, review, like, comment, share. Share with your friends, share with your family, hell, even share with your enemies. On today's episode, my guest is Dr. William Bernstein, Harvard professor, cultural historian, and author of Freeman's Challenge: The Murder That Shook America's Original Prison for Profit. We're diving into how the 19th century blueprint for mass incarceration was born long before the 1980s and what that means for America right now. But that's enough of the intro. Let's get to the show. My guest today is Dr. Robin Bernstein, the Dillon Professor of American History and Professor of African and African American Studies at Harvard University. She's one of the leading voices examining how race has been constructed in America from the 19th century to today. Her book, Freeman's Challenge: The Murder That Shook America's Original Prison for Profit, explores the story of William Freeman, a young Black man whose tragic encounter with the first prison for profit in Auburn, New York, exposed the economic machinery that turned incarceration into industry. Bernstein's work reframes what we think we know about the origins of mass incarceration, showing that the system wasn't born in the modern era, but rooted in early capitalism, racial hierarchy, and the violent genius of those who realized crime could be monetized. We're going to talk about the history behind the system, the moral gymnastics we still perform to justify it, and the fight for justice that continues today. So without further ado, here's Dr. Robin Bernstein. As I said at the top, I'm here with Dr. Robin Bernstein. Dr. Robin, also, ladies and gentlemen, I just found this out before we jumped on and started recording. Dr. Robin also went to the University of Maryland. This is not some scheme for my audience to send their children to the University of Maryland, but it wouldn't hurt. Dr. Robin, thank you for joining the show. We're about to have a very important conversation that I know my audience will definitely learn from, and I'm looking forward to it.
Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, it's absolutely my pleasure. And I always like starting off the interviews with, let's go back in time. So you've built your career studying how race has been constructed in the U.S. over centuries. Can you take us back to your own background? What first sparked your interest in history? And what led you specifically into exploring race, performance, and incarceration?
Yeah. Well, I'll start with the history question.
Okay.
So I think I was always just kind of interested in history, but I do remember there was one influence when I was a little girl. Mm-hmm. I read this really interesting book about the search for the coelacanth. So the coelacanth is a fish. And it's a fish that everybody thought was extinct. And it was a small fish. And then this huge fish got caught somehow. It was giant. It was like 6 feet long. And it looked exactly like the coelacanth, except that it was so much bigger and the coelacanth was supposedly extinct. Mm-hmm. So this set off a great big search to find a living coelacanth that had giganticized, basically. And it was a very exciting book for a kid. But the part of it that really blew my mind was when the scientists finally found a living coelacanth. They found it off the coast of an island off the coast of Africa. And when they finally found a living coelacanth, of course, the people who lived on this island totally knew about the fish. Mm-hmm. And what they said to the scientists, it wasn't lost at all. And what they said to the scientists was that the fish didn't taste very good, but its scales were useful for scraping bicycle tires. And I probably read this when I was about 10 years old, and it just blew my mind. And a number of things about it blew my mind. One was that things that we thought were true might not be true. that like this fish was supposedly extinct. It wasn't extinct. But also that the knowledge we're looking for, somebody already has it. And it is somebody, in this case, it was a group of people who were not defined as scientists. So these quote unquote scientists came in and they were searching and searching for this knowledge. And it turned out ordinary people already had it. And part of what I really loved was the fact that they said it was good for scraping bicycle tires, that these were not people who were somehow outside of the modern world. These were people who had bicycles. They were in the modern world. I had a bicycle. I was 10, and they were like me in that they knew bicycles. And so this just really started me thinking about the recovery of history, that things that we think are gone are not necessarily gone, and actually very ordinary people like me might have the key to something amazing. So that was really when it first started, when I first started thinking about history and knowledge. But where I got interested in African American studies, again, this is a child's story. I got interested in it really honestly in first grade. Something that happened to me, that happened to a lot of people, was Roots was broadcast on television. And I was in the first grade, and my parents framed it in a really interesting way that I think was really smart. So my parents wanted me and my brother to watch Roots. Now, we are a white Jewish family, and they were very clear that this was not our family history. This was not our racial history. But the way they framed it, this was American history. That all of it, all of Roots, the stories of the Black characters in Roots, the stories of the white characters in Roots, the stories of evil, the stories of violence, the stories of resistance and triumph, all of it, the whole thing of it was American history. And I needed to watch it because I was an American. And I needed to know that this was informing my life, all of it, all of its complexity. So I watched it. I was a first grader. I watched it, and it upset me terribly. The thing that upset me most about it was that, really honestly, this is how I learned what slavery was. I was probably 8. And what upset me so much about it was the idea of slavery itself. The idea that a person could be owned or a person could own another person. And part of what upset me about that so much was that I could not comprehend it. It just made no sense to me. And no matter how much I turned it over and over in my head, I just could not make it make sense. It just made no sense. And now, of course, as an adult who has spent 40 years studying slavery, I understand that the reason it made no sense was that slavery makes no sense. That, in fact, it is not possible for a human to be owned or to own another human. It makes no sense. And what bothered me so much and upset me so much as an 8-year-old is what still bothers me about it, the lie of it, the epistemological violence of it. So that's my answer to how I got interested in history and in particular African American history.
I have 2 follow-up questions. One is, well, they're both pretty personal. So don't have to answer them if you don't want to, but I'm curious. Seems like your parents were pretty progressive. Now, you come from a Jewish background and Roots was in the 70s. Were your parents connected, or did your parents have any family members that were connected or had been a part of the Holocaust?
In a direct line, no. All 4 of my grandparents were born in the United States, and all 4 of my grandparents were born before the Holocaust.
Okay.
Extended family, of course. I mean, there's I don't think there's a Jewish family on the planet that doesn't have extended family that died in the Holocaust.
Is it because of that? Because studying history, I see so many Jewish people. One of the college kids that was killed in Mississippi was Jewish. There's a connection of the Jewish community, specifically in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, that are fighting for civil rights. And I've always said, well, because they see the connection here of slavery, Jim Crow, segregation, and in what happened there. Were your parents just progressive, or was it they saw, because of history, this is something that you also need to learn?
That's a great question. Nobody's asked me that question before. My parents, and thank God they're both still alive, so I'll talk about them in the present tense, even though we're
Okay.
talking about the 70s.
Uh-huh.
My parents are just generally progressive people. They are generally anti-racist people. I think their own politics came into consciousness through the Vietnam War. My
Mm.
parents were both strongly opposed to the Vietnam War. They marched against the war in Vietnam. They were So I think if they were here, I think that's how they would answer this question.
Hmm.
I think they cared about racial justice and still care about racial justice among a constellation of issues. But I think what really brought them into a political world for them personally was the Vietnam War.
Okay. And the second part of the question, and I'm always fascinated when I talk to Jewish people because it's a religion, but it's also a grouping of people. You can be Jewish and not practice the faith, and you can also be Jewish and not be ethnically Jewish.
Mhm.
Do you consider yourself, in American standards, white? And if you do, watching Roots as that young child, did you have what they call now white guilt? Or did you look at it just as this, I don't understand this, this is just horrible? In other words, did you take on guilt, or was it just, this is horrible?
I don't think I did take on guilt. I don't think that's what I felt. I think because remember, I was looking at it as a whole,
Mm-hmm.
and I understood that nobody in my individual family had been in the United States before the Civil War. Actually, that's not true. I recently found out that somebody was, but at the time, I thought that nobody was.
Right.
And so my family had no personal connection to enslavement from any perspective. So I wouldn't say that what I felt was guilt. I would say that what I felt was horror.
Mm.
And I would also say that what I felt was a sense of responsibility as an American. And it was a deep sense of responsibility as an American. I understood that what I was looking at was not my people per se, that none of the characters in Roots were anything like my personal family. I
Mm-hmm.
understood that. But I also understood that all of them were like me in that they were Americans and I was an
Mm.
American. And what I really understood, I wouldn't describe it, I wouldn't say that what I felt was white guilt. What I would say was that I felt a very serious moral sense of responsibility as an American. And that is something
Mm.
I still feel.
Okay. All right. That's really interesting. I love getting different perspectives. That's the reason why I started the show, ladies and gentlemen. I love getting different perspectives of people looking at things differently, because you see this push to erase history, and we'll get into more of this later in the conversation, to erase history, and they frame it as, well, we can't teach little kids this because they feel guilty. But when you don't come from it, or don't have a direct connection from it like yourself, it's like, I don't have anything to feel guilty about. I don't think anybody should have anything to feel guilty about. It's history. But also, it's just horrific. But that's enough about me pontificating. Let's get to your book. So the latest book, Freeman's Challenge, looks at one man's story to uncover the beginnings of the prison for-profit system. How did you first discover this story, and what made you realize it could reveal something foundational about America?
I discovered the story by accident, and I think that's how a lot of history books get started. I stumbled across something that I thought should not exist, and it did exist, and that made me understand that something that I thought about history was not true. So what I stumbled across was a a reference, it was literally in a footnote, to a stage performance that happened in 1846 in Auburn, New York. I had never heard of Auburn. I didn't know anything about it. And
Hmm.
what happened in this stage performance, according to this footnote, was that it showed on stage a black man murdering a white family. And I immediately, so my background is in history of the 19th century, and in particular, the history of theater. And I said, wait a minute, wait, what? This thing existed on stage in 1846? And I knew that that was almost impossible. And the reason I knew that was that in the 19th century, and especially in the mid-century, white people absolutely did not want to see representations of Black on white violence on stage. And they did not want to see this. They wanted so badly not to see this that they would actually doctor productions of Othello to remove that imagery. So they were going to enormous lengths to avoid this particular spectacle. And I said, wait a minute, what? White people were paying for this in Auburn, New York in 1846? So at first I thought it must be a mistake, but then I quickly verified that it was true.
Wow.
And so I thought, okay, that means this is so anomalous. Something big must have happened in Auburn, New York in 1846 that would cause white people to behave in a way that was radically different from white people at the same time in other places. And so I thought, what was it? That's so weird. So I started researching it. I was just so curious. And I knew that something was very strange. So I started researching it, and I found out that the show was about somebody named William Freeman. I had never heard of William Freeman, and that it was based on true facts. It was based on a real murder. And so I started digging deeper and deeper and deeper. So when I started, I didn't know anything about the Auburn Prison. I wasn't thinking about the history of prison for profit. What really hooked me was the fact that something happened that caused race to shake. Something race shaking happened in 1846 to cause this white appetite for this particular kind of spectacle. Now, what we know is that today, that white appetite is enormous. There's an enormous white appetite for spectacles of Black on white violence. But that was not the norm in 1846. So something happened to make people, white people, in that moment, less like their peers and more like us. What could it be? So I started diving in deeper and deeper and deeper. So I learned who William Freeman was. I'm sure we're going to talk about this more. But the more I learned about who he was and what he did, that led me to a much bigger story. The big story, I realized, and it took me a long time to realize this, the really big story was behind the murder. The murder was not the story. What was behind the murder, William Freeman had a really important claim. He had something very important to say. And what he had to say had been suppressed for almost 2 centuries. And once I realized that, I knew I had to write the book.
Okay. All right. So I was going to do this later, but now you've reeled me in. I don't know if you noticed, but I leaned in as you started. Just a fantastic storyteller. Can you tell us about William Freeman? Because when I hear that name, I'll automatically think of a former slave that became a free man.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So William Freeman was always free. He was born free. And that's actually really important to the story. So William Freeman was African American and also Native American on his mother's side. Specifically, he was Stockbridge Narragansett on his mother's side. He was born just coincidentally in Auburn, New York. And he grew up there. He was his father had been enslaved and his grandparents had been enslaved. So his grandparents were Harry and Kate. They had been forced in 1793 to come to the land that would become Auburn. It was land that had just very recently been stolen from the Cayuga people. Harry and Kate were forced by their enslaver to come to this newly empty, well, it was not at all empty, but it was newly available to white ownership land. And they were forced to start building the buildings that would become Auburn. They eventually became free. And when they became free, they chose the name Freeman. So what you said before is exactly right. What they were articulating when they chose that name and when their children chose that same name and their grandchildren inherited that name, what they were saying was what mattered to them. They were saying what they cared about. They were saying who they thought of themselves to be. As of course you know, and I'm sure many of your listeners know, many people who became free from slavery chose the name of their former enslaver. And Harry and Kate absolutely could have done that, but they didn't. They named themselves Freeman. So what that tells us is what mattered to this family. And William Freeman was born in 1824. So he was born free in New York State. This was all happening in New York State. He was part of the first fully free generation in his family. So that's who he was. And he grew up in this town of Auburn, which at the time was a pretty small town, but it was growing. Part of the reason it was growing was because it was the home of the original prison for profit. And I hope we're going to talk about that. How prison for profit was actually invented in Auburn, New York, the place where William Freeman just happened to be born. So in his childhood, he had a hard childhood in a lot of ways. His father died when he was young. His mother struggled to raise him and his sister and his two sisters, one of whom was probably developmentally disabled, although we'll never really know. She struggled to raise him. He had to work from an early age. But in a lot of ways, his life was happy when he was growing up. He was part of the founding family of Auburn, New York, the founding Black family. He was part of a beloved and deeply respected family. And his family loved him very much. So that was who William Freeman started out as.
Okay, so you brought up the prison for profit. Let's kind of get into that. And most people think that the prison for profit started in the 1980s and 90s, but through your work at William Freeman, you're finding out Auburn, New York, 1840s. So can you walk us through how early America led the groundwork for monetization incarceration, for monetizing incarceration?
Yeah, thank you. And I love that phrase, monetizing incarceration. When we think about prison for profit, very often what we're thinking of is private prisons. And you're absolutely right that private prisons, prisons that are themselves corporations, that is a 20th century invention. That did not exist in the 19th century. The Auburn prison was a public prison. I mean, it was a state prison always. And it was never itself private. But the claim that I'm making in this book is that if you have a prison that exists at its absolute core to monetize, as you said, you have a prison that exists at its absolute core to make money, to make profits, that's a prison for profit. And that's one of the claims that I'm really making in this book. I think we need to redefine prison for profit and not limit it to private prisons, which are actually a very small percentage of prisons today. What we need to do is look at a much larger entanglement between capitalism and prisons. And when we look at that larger entanglement, we see a much longer and very different history. So let me tell you the story of how prison for profit began in Auburn, New York. And it began before William Freeman was born. It began in 1816.
Okay.
So basically what you had in Auburn, New York was a group of white businessmen. And these were people who wanted to make money. And that's really all they cared about. They did not care about justice. They did not care about protecting the public. They did not care about reforming criminals and, helping them to lead better lives. They didn't care about any of that. What they wanted to do was make money. And what happened was that in 1816, the New York State government offered a contract of $20,000, which was the equivalent of about $500,000 today. They offered this contract of $20,000 to a vicinity that would build a prison. Now, from the state's perspective, they were offering money to build a prison because they thought they needed a prison. At the time, New York State had only one prison and it was overrun. So from the governmental perspective, they were just trying to get more prisons.
Mm-hmm.
But these white businessmen in Auburn, New York, they had an incredible insight, which to us is obvious, but it's only obvious to us because people in the past came up with it.
Mm-hmm.
What they realized at the time, Auburn was a tiny little village of about 2,000 people. And what they realized was that if they got this sudden influx of the equivalent of $500,000, all of a sudden, it was going to completely transform the economy of Auburn. And remember, then there would be more money coming in every year.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, think about it. If you've got a little tiny village with 2,000 people and you just flood it with $500,000, it's going to change everything.
Mm-hmm.
And that, to us, that's so obvious. But this was a completely original idea at the time. So these white businessmen put together a contract. They bid. And they bid because they wanted to turn Auburn from a village into a city. That was their goal. So that was their first idea. Let's take money from the state to transform our economy. But then they had a second idea. The second idea was to build the prison on the banks of a river. There was a river that goes right through Auburn. It's still there. They built it on the banks of this river for the purpose of harnessing water power. Why did they want water power? Because they wanted to have factories, industrial factories built into the prison. Their second idea, in addition to taking money from the state, was to have prisoners forced to labor to manufacture consumer goods inside the prison. And then they had a third idea. The third idea was to have local businesses, including their own, leasing the prisoners' labor, basically convict leasing. They had this idea of convict leasing. So the structure that they came up with was they built the factories into the prison. They got the prisoners. Local businesses took possession of the factories. They bought the labor of the prisoners. The prisoners got no money, not 1 cent, nothing. They forced the prisoners to labor to make things like shoes and animal harnesses and carpets. And the prisoners were making these goods. The companies then sold the goods throughout New York State and also throughout the Northeast. So this was an incredible operation. They were getting money and value from 3 different directions. They were getting money from the state. They were getting money from these local businesses that were taking the labor of prisoners. And then they were getting the value of the labor of the prisoners. This was a totally new construction of prisons. This was a new concept of what a prison can be. This is a prison as a factory. Basically, the whole prison functioned as one giant factory. This was the Auburn State Prison. And let's be really clear about some of the things that didn't matter to the people who started the prison. Justice did not matter. Punishment did not matter. They weren't trying to punish the prisoners. Now, the Auburn State Prison was an extremely violent place. And the reason it was so violent was because it is very hard to get people to work for no compensation. Mm-hmm. And really, the only way you can get people to work for no compensation is through violence. So it was an extremely violent place. But the purpose of the violence was not to punish. The purpose of the violence was to extract labor. So this was a radical new idea about what a prison was. And this is what grew in Auburn, New York. And this is what was up and running at the moment when William Freeman was born, less than a mile away.
This is 170 years before we get to that 1980s.
Yep.
And they have literally written the blueprint to the very things that we see today. And also during that time where we are 60 years before the Civil War, mm-hmm. where slavery is going to be hotly contested, but there's already kind of murmurs in the country. They created a new form of slavery but getting the state to finance it. As a businessman, I'm thinking to myself, as a businessman, that's brilliant. As a human being, good God, that is devious. That is Lex Luthor level evil and brilliant at the same time. I don't mean to marvel at the business intellect of these people, but in a capitalist society, they figured out a blueprint that worked. I don't know why we don't understand. I don't know what happened to Auburn. I'm sure we'll get into it. But okay, so they have this forced labor. They've created a new form of slavery.
Yeah. And they use that word, by the way.
Oh, they actually used the word.
Yes.
Okay,
proudly.
so they weren't hiding it. Okay.
Oh,
okay.
no. They called the prisoners, quote, slaves of the state, unquote. And let's also put this in context for what else was happening in New York State at the time. This was at the exact moment when New York State was engaging in what was called gradual emancipation. So basically, Black people in New York State at this exact time were slowly becoming free. And we can see that in William Freeman's own family. His grandparents became free. His father started out enslaved, but his father became free. And this was part of what was happening. New York State was transforming from a slavery-based economy to a state capitalism-based economy. And the prison was absolutely a part of that. So there's nothing coincidental going on here. So at the exact moment when New York was becoming a free state, this new kind of prison is built in Auburn, and they proudly called the prisoners slaves of the state.
Now, the prisoners, what was their demographic makeup?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, and this also, this is so interesting to me. The very first group of prisoners, the very first ones to occupy the prison, who also, by the way, were forced to build the prison. They built the prison and then they were forced to occupy it. As far as my research shows, 100% of them were white. So this tells us something really important. This tells us that the prison was not invented to re-enslave Black people per se. It was built to enslave people. And this is a really important difference. This interrupts some of the stories that we've received about the origins of capitalism and prisons. The popular story that we've received is that prison for profit was invented in the South. It was invented after the Civil War as a way of re-enslaving Black people. And this is a radically different story. It's 50 years earlier. It's in the North, not the South. And it's a story absolutely about slavery by another name, but it is a different racial dynamic. It was started not for the purpose of re-enslaving Black people. It was started for the purpose of extracting forced labor value, for the purpose of serving capitalism. So that was the very, very first group of prisoners. But as you can guess, it did not stay white. So it starts as a white thing. It does not stay that way. It very, very quickly becomes a disproportionately Black population. So by the time William Freeman was incarcerated, and we'll get to this where he was incarcerated, by the time he was incarcerated, approximately 1 in 9 of the prisoners were Black. And to put that in perspective, at the time, this was 1840s, about 2% of New York State was Black. So what that tells us is that Black people were overrepresented by about fourfold. So we go from Black people being not represented at all to being grossly overrepresented in about 3 decades. And now, of course, in New York State, Black and brown people constitute about 70% of incarcerated people in that state. So just like you said before about how we're seeing a blueprint for today in this story in Freeman's Challenge from the 1840s, that's exactly what we're seeing. We're seeing an escalation of racialized incarceration. We're seeing the roots of that.
I would love to. I don't know if I don't know if you know the history of it, but I know in Virginia, somewhere in the middle 1700s, they outlawed indentured servitude, and they allowed, and most indentured servants and servant, indentured servants were Irish, and they got rid of it and allowed them to start to own land and things of that nature. Was there something similar around the same time in New York? And these first white prisoners, did they happen to be Irish?
So a lot of them were immigrants, actually, of these first prisoners. But your question about indentured servitude is really important. So indentured servitude was one of the ways that slavery, Black slavery, continued in New York State after the quote unquote official end of slavery. So the way gradual emancipation worked in New York State was that after 1827, everybody born in New York State was free, regardless of race. However, for people who were born of formerly of enslaved parents, so up before 1827, people who were born of at least an enslaved mother, they were born free, but they were forced into indentured servitude for decades. So what this meant was that two of William Freeman's uncles were born technically free, but they were indentured. They were forced into indenture to their mother's enslaver for decades. So the term of indenture was 21 years. So William Freeman's older uncle, he was technically born free, but became fully free, really free, in 1848. So this is a way that slavery just dragged on and on and on, forced labor, and that was a specifically racial, anti-Black indentured servitude.
How does the story of William Freeman and the murder play in all of this?
Yeah. So William Freeman is growing up in Auburn, New York. He's growing up literally a mile away from the original prison for profit, and it's big. Oh, Bruce, this building is so big. It still exists, by the way. It is the Auburn Prison still exists. It is today the oldest continually operating maximum security prison in the United States.
Maximum
This
security.
thing is maximum security. This thing is huge. So it's dominating the entire town, which is rapidly becoming a city. So he grows up here, he's working, and he's got, in some ways, a hard life, but in other ways, a good life. But everything changes for William Freeman in 1840. In that year, he's 15 years old. He is accused of stealing a horse. There's no hard evidence against him, but it doesn't matter. He's tried, he's convicted, and he's sentenced to 5 years hard, forced labor in the Auburn State Prison. He's a kid. He's 15. He's furious. So he goes into this prison and he immediately begins resisting. He tells his jailers that he does not want to work. He does not want to work for nothing. That was the phrase he used. He said, I don't want to work for nothing. And he meant two things by that. He meant nothing, meaning no crime. He had committed no crime. So he didn't want to work for nothing when he had committed no crime. But he also meant no pay. He thought of himself as a citizen. He was a citizen. Remember, he's part of the first fully free generation in his family. He's among the first fully free generation in New York State. He is a citizen. And part of what's core to that identity is the ability to work and be compensated for the labor, for your own labor. So he says, I don't want to work for nothing. He says it explicitly over and over again. As I mentioned, the Auburn State Prison is an incredibly violent place. The retribution for his resistance was truly terrible. There was enormous violence against him. And in the worst moment of violence, a guard beat him over the head and beat him so severely that he had a brain injury. And he also lost hearing in one of his ears, and lost all of it in one of his ears and most of it in his other ear. So he's enduring this horrible violence, forced labor, but he keeps resisting. He keeps resisting. After he gets out of prison, it's 1845 now. He's 20 years old. He's deaf. He's horrifically traumatized. He has a brain injury. And he wants what he wants. The single most important thing that he wants is back pay. He wants to be paid for 5 years of labor. His perspective is that the state has stolen 5 years of wages from him, and he wants to recover those wages from the state. So he launches a legal campaign. And again, this is a 20-year-old person who has spent a quarter of his life in prison. And he launches a legal campaign. He goes to the governor and tries to get the governor to help him and to recover these lost wages. He is laughed at and he's dismissed. He tries for 6 months to get his back pay. And after 6 months, he changes his goal. He no longer wants back pay. What he wants is payback. And at that point, William Freeman committed a murder. And when I say that, I'm not giving anything away. It's right there in the title of the book, Freeman's Challenge, The Murder That Shook America's Original Prison for Profit. He committed a murder that challenged the Auburn State Prison, and it really challenged the very idea of prison for profit. And he made this mighty prison shake.
Wow. Okay. I don't want to give. We want people to go get your book, and we don't want people to. We don't want to give too much away. So go get the book, ladies and gentlemen, if you want to hear the continuation. This is to be continued. I want to get more into this monetized incarceration and more into your research. So your research shows that some of these histories we've known at one time, but got buried or forgotten, which is happening so much right now. Why do you think Americans tend to forget or are encouraged to forget these uncomfortable parts of our history?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. I love that question. I think that the uncomfortable parts of our history make people uncomfortable, and they especially make people in power uncomfortable. In the particular case of Auburn, one of the things that William Freeman challenged was white pride. So the white people who were running Auburn's businesses, both inside the prison and outside, the prison made Auburn prosperous. The prison was a source of pride because the prison was so evilly innovative. It was the identity of Auburn. It made Auburn literally world famous. Famous people were coming from Europe to tour the Auburn State Prison and learn about it and take the model back to Europe. Because, by the way, once people figured out that a prison could make money, you better believe that that idea spread. And by the time William Freeman was born, there were prisons for profit built in literal self-conscious imitation of Auburn, were built all over the United States and all over the world. So some of the best known prisons that we think of today from the 19th century were literally built in Auburn's model. So when we think about San Quentin, for example, or Sing Sing, or Parchman, these were built in the model of Auburn. So white Auburnites were prosperous because of this system of prison for profit. They were proud. This was their identity. Remember also, Auburn was the name of the city. It was the name of the prison. And it was the name of the model of incarceration. The Auburn system meant this system of incarceration. So this was pride. So when William Freeman named it as a form of organized theft, wow. William Freeman was saying, I have had my wages stolen from me by the Auburn State Prison. This is not justice. This is organized theft. Well, you better believe white people did not want to hear that. So they didn't want to hear it in 1845, and they don't want to hear it now. So it's not just that people forget things that are uncomfortable. People actively refuse to incorporate knowledge that challenges who they think they are. William Freeman told white Auburn that the city was not what they wanted it to be, that they were not who they thought of themselves as. And you better believe that white people did not take that very well.
So I always use this term moral gymnastics. We all do it. And
Yeah.
I'm not going to call out anybody else because I would be a hypocrite. I do the same thing. We all have these moral gymnastics. And I'm sure the people of this town were listening to this man, William Freeman, and not wanting to hear anything about it because it is an attack against them. And I know in their mind, they're thinking this is a criminal because they're saying, well, who cares what's happening to these people? They're criminals. And we are hearing those similar type of arguments today. So when you look at the current debates, whether it's mass incarceration, police reform, or calls to abolish private prisons, what echoes from history do you hear most loudly?
Oh, most loudly. I mean, I hear so many echoes, but you've asked for most loudly. I think what I hear most loudly, you're absolutely right that they wanted to understand William Freeman simply as a criminal. And they also wanted to understand him as an irrational person. So remember, he did have a head injury. He did have a brain injury. And he did have certain difficulties as a result of that brain injury. And also he was deaf. He was deaf end, I should say. So what they wanted to do was think of him. Basically, two different ways emerged of thinking about William Freeman in the time. One was that he was this purely vicious person simply because that's who he was. And of course, they racialized that. So one of the claims I'm making in the book is that William Freeman's trial, which got very big, very fast and got publicized nationally, was one of the origins of the racist lie of Black criminalization. That this is so this is a really big echo that we hear today. This racist idea that there is some sort of necessary inherent magnetism between Blackness and criminality. William Freeman's story is actually one of the points of origin of that story, of that lie. But then the other thing that they wanted to believe was that he was simply 100% irrational, that he was quote unquote a lunatic. And if he's there critiquing prison for profit. And if you want to defend prison for profit, it is very convenient to say this person is purely irrational. Nothing this person has to say has any validity at all. It's just the ravings of a lunatic. So they found both ways to not just dismiss him, but to muffle what he was saying. And his own lawyer, he had a lawyer who was actually William Henry Seward, who was at the time the former governor of New York State. William Henry Seward actually defended William Freeman, but he defended him with the insanity defense. His own lawyer was muffling what he had to say. And most scholars since that time have simply taken William Henry Seward's perspective for granted and have said that when people have talked about William Freeman, they have basically thought of him as an irrational person, as a quote unquote lunatic. And my big aha when I was researching this, I'm researching it more and more and more, and I'm coming to this slow realization that what William Freeman was saying was completely rational and actually really important. He had been called irrational, and he did have certain mental problems as a result of his brain injury. But his central ethical, moral claim was completely rational. So going back to your question about what do I see in William Freeman's story today, I see the ongoing and always escalating criminalization of Black people. And I also see the suppression of the idea that we can critique prison for profit from a moral perspective.
So you obviously have done great work. You've gotten praise for it. But I imagine you also encountered some resistance because you're challenging dominant narratives, kind of like attacking quote unquote white pride, right?
Mhm.
Uh, while people are doing what I love to call moral gymnastics. What kind of pushbacks do you face and how do you navigate that?
Yeah. You know, much push. I have occasionally gotten pushback. I did an event in New York City where one member of the audience was just outraged that I could have any sympathy at all for somebody who did commit a murder. And I mean, let's be really honest. William Freeman, after he got out of prison, he did commit a murder. And what I wanted to do in the book was treat everybody's pain with great seriousness. I did not want to trivialize anybody's pain. I wanted, of course, to take William Freeman's pain enormously seriously. And I also wanted to take seriously the pain of the people he killed and the survivors of that murder. So I took everybody very seriously. Where I have gotten pushback is on taking William Freeman's pain seriously. So in this one particular event, a woman was just really angry that I could take seriously the pain of somebody who did in fact commit a murder.
Okay. You are a professor. You are guiding the young minds of today.
I'm trying.
What do you notice about the younger generations of students and approaching these types of topics of race, justice, and history? Do you see shifts in how they are thinking compared to when you first started teaching?
That's such an interesting question. Yeah, I've seen all kinds of changes. At this point, everything is changing so rapidly, minute to minute. I feel like I can't characterize where my students are right now because they just change so fast. The world is changing so fast. What I will say is that, there was a time when I first started teaching when critiques of prisons were very rare, and most people that I was encountering in the classroom were not thinking critically about the history of prisons at all. They just didn't know very much about the history of prisons. And the prison abolition movement has done a fantastic job of getting the word out into the popular consciousness that prisons are political, that they do not simply exist to administer justice, and in fact they might work counter to that goal. So the idea that prisons are political, that prisons can be abolished, that the prison abolition movement exists, that is a big change I've seen in students. That's pretty common knowledge now among my students, and 20 years ago it wasn't.
So I have a question about abolishing prisons. Now, I'm all for certain things, defunding the police and things of that nature. When people say abolish the police, I'm not for that because I need to call somebody if my house gets broken into or I have an issue. I need to call somebody. I can't take care of it myself all the time. The abolishing of prisons, what is the alternative? Because though I believe there are a majority of prisoners that can be rehabilitated, I've seen them, I've met them, I know them.
Mm-hmm.
I also know that some people should never be let out.
Mm-hmm.
So, like, how does that work with just abolishing prisons?
Yeah. Well, Ruth Gilmore, who is one of the thought leaders of the prison abolition movement, has made a really compelling case that there is no simple substitution. Like, we will abolish prisons and then there will be this new thing instead.
Hmm.
That her perspective that she has articulated is that there is a suite of societal changes that would have to come first to
Hmm.
make prisons unnecessary. And we can think about things from reparative justice movements. We can think about treatment for drug addiction, for example. There are many, many things that when you put them all together and implement them all over a long period of time, prisons would become less and less quote unquote necessary and eventually could dwindle down to nothing. So that's, to me, that's a really compelling vision. I think my own perspective. So that's the perspective that is articulated in the prison abolition movement. But
Hmm.
now I'll say what I think.
Okay.
What I think is that we know that prisons do not do what they claim to do. What they claim to do is make the world a safer place, or make the United States, for example, a safer place and a more just place. And we have so much evidence that they simply fail to do that. So my question is, if they fail at what they say they are trying to do, then what is the justification for continuing down this path that we know doesn't work? And by the way, it didn't work even in the 19th century. And there was a huge amount of evidence from the very beginning that prisons were not making communities safer and they were not administering justice. So if we know they're not doing what they say they exist to do, what justification is there to continue them? So I am in favor of safety. I am in favor of justice. And the question that I am asking is, how can we actually have these things?
Hmm. This is heavy, right? This is heavy on my soul. This is a heavy topic because I know people who have been incarcerated. I know people who have been wrongfully incarcerated. I know people who have been they were incarcerated rightfully, right? And when you're dealing with this and you bring it up in New York State that 70, you said 70%
Yeah,
of
roughly.
the
Mm-hmm.
roughly 70% are black and brown people,
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
and you're doing the research and you're finding out it goes all the way back to the 1810s, right?
Mhm,
What
mhm.
gives you hope? And
Oh,
what can ordinary people do today to better understand and engage with the history that you're uncovering?
hmm hmm yeah. What gives me hope? What gives me hope is activist communities. Activist communities are pushing back against prison for profit in particular. In New York State, there is legislation that is being proposed and is being voted on to do two things that William Freeman was exactly calling for. There is legislation pending in New York State to make sure that any labor that happens inside prisons benefit the prisoners.
Mm.
And this is really crucial. William Freeman was not against working. William Freeman actually wanted to work. He wanted to be compensated. And this is exactly what people today want. It's the exact same claim. So this one bill called the No Slavery in New York Act will ensure that any labor that happens in prisons is, first of all, freely chosen, that no prisoner can be forced to work against their will. And if they choose to work, that the labor will benefit them in some way, specifically monetarily. And
Mhm.
then there's a second bill that is moving through legislation in New York State, which is about the conditions of labor, basically making sure that labor conditions are safe, that they are that they support life. And this is also what William Freeman was all about. William Freeman wanted to have a life. He wanted to have a livable life. And that is what the Auburn State Prison deprived him of. So when I think about these pieces of legislation that are moving forward, I feel a lot of hope. I mean, it also makes me enormously sad that the exact claims that William Freeman made, we still have to make them today because they have
Yeah.
not been achieved. But there are a number of states that have added language to their state constitutions, specifically outlawing carceral slavery, specifically countering the exact model that was born in Auburn, New York in 1816. So a number of states have actually already added that language to their constitutions or taken away the language permitting it. Nevada is one example. So we can do this. We can change the evil geniuses in Auburn in 1816. You compared them to Lex Luthor, and I think that's actually an apt comparison. I think the language that I've used to think about them is that they were evil geniuses.
Mm-hmm.
They were evil geniuses, but there's a lot of us countering the evil that they created, and there's more of us than there are of them.
For every Lex Luthor, there needs to be a Superman and Supergirl. So there we go. Dr. Robin, what would you like to leave my audience with?
Well, I think what I'd like to leave your audience with is a very simple idea, which is the idea that a non-incarcerated person can and should benefit from the labor of an incarcerated person. That's wrong. I am a non-incarcerated person. I do not think I have any right to benefit from the incarceration of another person, including through things like tax benefits. The idea that, a prison gives me a tax break because it contributes to the economy. Well, why should I get any kind of break based on the incarceration of other people? So I think that's what I'd like to leave your audience with. And then this idea that non-incarcerated people have no right to benefit from the labor of incarcerated people. And then finally, I hope people will check out Freeman's Challenge, The Murder That Shook America's Original Prison for Profit. If they do, they're going to meet an incredible teenager from history who was enormously brave. William Freeman was a flawed person, but he was so brave. He stood up against prison for profit at its source. He stood up against the entire city of Auburn. He stood up against prison guards while they were beating him. He was brave.
Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Robin Bernstein, thank you so much for coming on the show. This has been just a delightful conversation, and I know I've definitely learned a lot. Being a historian, didn't know, and I know my audience has as well, so thank you for sharing with us.
Thank you so much, Bruce. This has been wonderful.
It was my pleasure. Man, that was a heavy and powerful conversation. As a historian, I thought I understood the evolution of incarceration in this country, from the war on drugs to mass incarceration, but to hear how it all started in Auburn, New York, a place I've never heard of before, in the early 1800s, this is absolutely information that has blown my mind. It's wild and sad how these evil geniuses, as Dr. Bernstein called them, created a blueprint that still shapes our systems today, a systems that find a way to turn punishment into profit. And as she reminded us, this isn't just history. It's policy, it's economics, it's morality. Dr. Bernstein's work reminds us that history isn't just in the past, it's in the walls we still build and the people we still confine. And like William Freeman, whose story she so brilliantly resurrects, we have to keep demanding accountability, asking who really benefits when justice becomes a business. If you want to understand where this system came from and what it takes to change it, go pick up Freeman's Challenge, The Murder That Shook America's Original Prison for Profit. Dr. Robin Bernstein, I want to thank you for your brilliance, your courage, and your scholarship. And for everyone listening and watching, stay curious, stay honest, and keep asking the questions that history doesn't want to answer. Thank you for listening. Thank you for watching. And until next time, as always, I'll holla. Woo! That was a hell of a show. Thank you for rocking with us here on Unsolicited Perspectives with Bruce Anthony. Now, before you go, don't forget to follow, subscribe, like, comment, and share our podcast wherever you're listening or watching it to it. Pass it along to your friends. If you enjoy it, that means the people that you rock will enjoy it also. So share the wealth, share the knowledge, share the noise. And for all those people that say, well, I don't have a YouTube. If you have a Gmail account, you have a YouTube. Subscribe to our YouTube channel where you can actually watch our video podcast and YouTube exclusive content. But the real party is on our Patreon page, After Hours Uncensored and Talking Straight-ish. After Hours Uncensored is another show with my sister. And once again, the key word there is uncensored. Those are exclusively on our Patreon page. Jump onto our website at unsolicitedperspectives.com for all things us. That's where you can get all of our audio, video, our blogs, and even buy our merch. And if you really feel generous and want to help us out, you can donate on our donations page. Donations go strictly to improving our software and hardware so we can keep giving you guys good content that you can clearly listen to and that you can clearly see. So any donation would be appreciative. Most importantly, I want to say thank you for listening and watching and supporting us. And I'll catch you next time. Audi 5000. Peace.